Okay, students, hopefully by this time we have learned in this course and the assignments that you've done, hopefully you've recognized that the U.S. federal government supports both corporate and business needs for inexpensive workers and high profits. It is hoped that you have understood that since its inception, the United States has maintained groups of rightless workers. The United States, in essence, practices exclusionary citizenship. It began with indentured servants, it moved to slavery. Today we call it undocumented immigration, but yet it is a contracted form of labor. And we have witnessed disenfranchisement and dispossession of the immigrant worker sprinkled with white racism. So when we take a look at the immigrant experience, the fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant, translates into policy that prevents people from achieving social justice and equality. So there is one historian, his name is Aristide Zolberg, who wrote a book on U.S. immigration and naturalization law, and he entitled it A Nation by Design. So hopefully you have seen that throughout the immigrant experience, workers gain respect with employment, and everyone is committed to work when decently employed. And immigrant workers throughout history are following the logic of where wealth can be redistributed. Unions have always asked for decency in meeting subsistence needs, and every immigrant community that is now part of the American social fabric develops strategies to improve the immigrant community's struggle to survive. So as far as immigration is concerned, there is a sense of awareness and a commitment to immigrant rights and responsibilities that have always been part of the naturalization process. So between 1870 and 1920, the industrial and political elites of both Mexico and the United States are going to take hold of their respective countries, and they're going to organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history. That's right, students, between 1870 and 1920, Mexico and the United States are going to take off in a worldwide industrial revolution. And they would do it with the aid of and at the expense of black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, Mexican labor, Native American labor, female labor, child labor, and they'll reward them differently by race, sex, national origin, age, and social class. And this march of economic growth transformed existing social relations, and it introduced radical changes in production and occupational structures. And the main areas of occupation for those living in and moving to northern Mexico and the United States Southwest was cattle ranching, agriculture, mining, and transportation. And so I provide for you a chapter on the Mexican experiences between 1900 and 1930. And you're going to be reading a chapter from Zaragoza Vargas's book, and hopefully you will appreciate the Mexican experience, the immigrant experience at the turn of the 20th century. Now, Benito Juarez, the self-proclaimed Indian president of Mexico and Latin America, liberated Mexicans from French rule and initiated human rights legislation for the majority of his countrymen through constitutional reform between 1860 and 1872. And Benito Juarez wanted most Mexicans to own the land they lived on, and conservatives in Mexico worked hard to undermine his administration. And his program, known as La Reforma, ended with Juarez's death. And without democratic and institutional stability, a return to centralized autocracy and economic exploitation under the regime of this man named Porfirio Diaz became inevitable. So after Benito Juarez's death in 1872, Porfirio Diaz, this man that you see here in this slide, he had assisted Juarez in the overthrow of the French occupation. He's going to take over as Mexico's leader. And he, unlike Juarez, had no use for his indigenous past. Diaz is going to change Juarez's land reform efforts and introduce new land laws requiring formal legal title, of which many Mexicans, native peoples, and poor peasants and farmers could not produce. They did not have legal title. And Porfirio Diaz's desire to control Mexico on behalf of a racialist order is important to understand because it fits the pattern established by the Mexican independence record of a conservative replacing a liberal and deliberately deconstructing reform policies aimed at alleviating the oppression of native, mestizo, and Afro-mestizo populations. You see, Mexico has always been involved in combating racism and worker exploitation. And under Porfirio Diaz, this is going to be sharpened through brutal economic policies and political tyranny. So the term Porfiriato that you see at the top of the slide, that is the term used to describe Diaz's dictatorial rule. His name was Porfirio Diaz. So the Porfiriato left an historical record of organized theft disguised as official policy. When you take a look at Mexico, the Mexican elite, the elite classes, they have a disdain for the Mexican working poor. The rich do not like the poor. Understand that. That's part of the Mexican expression. And it is reflected in their economic negotiations with Wall Street. So when you take a look at 19th century Mexican politics, it is filled with violence, the loss of territory, occupation, political deception, and Anglo intrigue. So as modernization, industrialization, immigration, urbanization, and economic growth exploded after the Civil War in the United States and after the French occupation in Mexico, farmers, workers, immigrant laborers, and native peoples on both sides of the border called for the overthrow of monopoly and capitalism in both countries, in the United States as well as Mexico. Now, one of the things that's most important about the United States and European immigration is that there were many contradictions that accompanied the emergence of modernity, and likewise in Mexico. On both sides of the border, there was rising wealth and productivity on the one hand, and increasing polarization of income and power on the other. So in both countries, in Mexico and the United States, there were demands for federal regulation and the notions of government regulating corporate power. And these demands emerged in the late 19th century, and they consumed the political debates at the turn of the century in both Mexico and the United States. And the rise of industrial capitalism rested on the conversion of millions of people into wage laborers, and that experience transformed their lives. And in the United States, hopefully those of you who have taken U.S. history understand that in the 1890s through to World War I, there were movements for change that were identified as the populist movement and progressive reform. Meanwhile, in Mexico, those movements for change became known as the revolution, la revolución. And then in Europe, they were experiencing a transformation from feudalism to capitalism. And that transformation will complete its final phase in what will be known as World War I. So when we go to Mexico, the Porfiriato in Mexico was violent. The advance of civilization through modernization, urbanization, immigration, and industrialization came at the expense of the working class, farmers, and peasants. And so, students, please read the chapter that accompanies this presentation. Because in Mexico, like in the United States, wealth, political power, and access to education were concentrated amongst the few. Overwhelmingly, in Mexico, people of European descent controlled both wealth and the governmental decision-making power. Foreign companies that were linked through Wall Street, and they were headquartered in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Austin, London, Paris, and Amsterdam, exercised power in Mexico. For instance, let me give you an example. Most of you know about Wrigley Spearmint Gum. Well, Wrigley Spearmint Gum operated in the Yucatan Peninsula. Then there was Randolph Hearst. Randolph Hearst ran a news service in New York, and his wealth controlled agricultural output in the Mexican northern states of Chihuahua and Durango. Then there was Phelps Dodge Copper Refinery, along with Kennecott Copper and Asarco, American Smelting and Refining Company. And these companies controlled mineral production along the border states of the southwest United States and northern Mexico. And then here in Los Angeles, there was what was known as the Los Angeles Richardson Construction Company. They controlled the agricultural output of the Mexican states of Sonora and Sinaloa. So these are just a few of the corporations that control the wealth of Mexico through Wall Street. So, at the turn of the century, in Mexico, native people's resistance movements are going to challenge the dictatorship, and in the process, they're going to spark a revolution. Let me just give you some examples. The Mayan people from the Yucatan Peninsula are going to rebel against unfair labor practice in the henequen plantations that were run by Wrigley. And the Yaqui people from the states of Sinaloa and Sonora are going to resist land encroachments from the Los Angeles Richardson Construction Company. So Porfirio Diaz, what he decided to do was ruthlessly put down both rebellions. And what he would do was capture Mayans and then send them as enslaved workers to Sonora and Sinaloa. And then he'd capture Yaquis from Sonora and Sinaloa and send them as enslaved workers to the Yucatan, conveniently replacing the threats. So when we take a look at the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican Revolution has many characters and many movements for change. And when you talk to every Mexican family that lives in the United States today, they have a personal story about relatives and their experiences in the Mexican Revolution. Because the ultimate cost of the revolution was the loss in lives. And approximately 2.1 million people are going to die between 1910 and 1920. And just 100 years after Hidalgo's September 16th Grito de Dolores, the carnage began when Francisco Madero declared the Diaz regime illegal on November 20th, 1910. Nearly every racial and class interest participated in revolutionary struggle to create a just society. And the reason why the Mexican Revolution has to be looked at is because numerous peoples at this time are going to enter the United States as a result of this revolution. So this is what historians call as the push. Many Mexicanos are going to be pushed into the U.S., but eventually we're going to see that the United States is going to need them likewise, because the United States is going to be participating in World War I and is going to require their labor forces. So while Mexico goes through a revolution, the United States is going to be entering World War I. But let's go to a film clip and appreciate the Mexican Revolution after 100 years celebration in Mexico.
As the first decade of the 20th century progressed, discontent with the government of Porfirio Diaz began to spread throughout the country. During his time in office, key principles such as social justice and the exercise of democracy had been ignored.
The Mexican Revolution. In 1908, Porfirio Diaz announced that he would retire from power at the end of his term because he believed that Mexico was ready for democracy. This statement unleashed a political fervor throughout the country.
In his book, The Presidential Succession in 1910, Francisco I. Madero set forth the need for a peaceful and democratic change. In 1909, he began to travel around the country, spreading a message that took root in the civic consciousness of the Mexican people: effective suffrage, no re-election.
As Madero's popularity increased, the government had him arrested. He was still in prison when the presidential elections were held, and Porfirio Diaz was elected for the 7th time.
Madero was able to escape, and he issued the Plan of San Luis, calling the election null and void and urging the people to take up arms for the cause of democracy.
The revolution erupted on November 20th, 1910. Peasants, laborers, miners, intellectuals, and the middle class joined the fight.
When the revolutionary forces occupied Ciudad Juárez, the government was forced to sign a peace treaty. Porfirio Díaz resigned the presidency and went into exile.
Madero made his triumphal entry into Mexico City. However, as the victor, he did not simply take over as president. He waited for new elections so that he could legitimately claim the presidency through the will of the citizens.
But Mexico continued to experience very difficult times, economically, socially, and politically.
In Morelos, Zapata's followers believed that Madero didn't support their struggle for land, and they issued the Plan Abayala against him.
To the north, Pascual Orozco rose up in arms to defend the people's demands.
Meanwhile, prominent members of the old regime organized the overthrow of Madero's government.
President Madero put General Victoriano Huerta in charge of defending his government, but Huerta entered into negotiations with the opposing group and supported the coup d'etat.
Madero was forced to resign, and Huerta assumed the presidency. The 10 tragic days ended with the death of Madero.
Venustiano Carranza, the governor of Coahuila, repudiated Huerta and issued the Plan of Guadalupe in order to restore constitutional order.
The country became a battlefield on which the constitutionalists fought the federal army. After more than a year of intense fighting, the constitutionalists forced Huerta to resign.
But the revolutionaries' victory did not solve the nation's enormous problems of democracy, social justice, land ownership, jobs, and education.
The followers of Carranza, Villa, and Zapata all wanted to be the ones to decide the country's course. As they were not able to come to an agreement, the revolution split into various factions.
At the Aguascalientes Convention, the followers of Villa and Zapata imposed their views, which focused more on social policy. The convention declared itself sovereign and repudiated Carranza.
Carranza moved his government to Veracruz and, starting in 1915 and supported by Obregon's troops, began an intense military campaign against Villa and Zapata.
With the military situation going his way, Carranza calls on Congress to draft a new constitution. It was adopted on February 5th, 1917.
Although different factions continued to vie for power, the Constitution opened the way for the country in the years following the Revolution by including the principles for which the country had fought: democracy, education, agrarian reform, and labor rights. Bicentennial of Independence, Centennial of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government.
Okay, students, we just saw the Mexican government's rendition of the Mexican Revolution, but what I want you to understand was that it was a very violent experience, and that nearly every racial and class interest participated in a revolutionary struggle to create a just society. Mexicans had been fighting for the longest time to create a society that would accept all of the different mixed bloods, all of the different races. And what's most important to understand is that the source of the wealth that was generated at the turn of the century and that was used for the financing of mass consumption and mass production was mining. So Mexico, with financial backing from Wall Street, tapped into its mineral wealth. And the United States developed the mineral wealth that once belonged to her neighbor to the south. So when you take a look at the border, Arizona and New Mexico on the US side, and Sonora and Chihuahua on the Mexican side, teemed with activity. And Mexicans filled the labor needs for this exploding industry. So again, in the chapter that I've assigned for this particular presentation, take a look at the need for Mexican labor and the importance of migration and immigration in the Mexican experience. And it's tied to what you all have been studying about the formation and control of labor forces. But we're going to go and take a look at a film clip from a documentary called Los Mineros. It was a PBS documentary, and we want to get a glimpse of the process of change that occurred in Arizona at the turn of the century. So let's watch a film clip from a PBS documentary entitled Los Mineros. We're going to visit a place called Clifton-Morenci in Arizona, and we'll appreciate how racism is an instrument of power used by those in power to perpetuate their power. And let's also appreciate the rich racist legacy of Arizona and recognize that the current crisis in Arizona and what's going on with the Mexican in Arizona is but a continuous expression of a deep-rooted hatred that whites have exhibited towards Mexicans in the state. So let's go and take a look at Los Mineros.
Clifton-Morenci, Arizona. There is little left to remind us of the fortunes that were made and lost in these hills. Copper made this one of the richest mining districts in the United States. Thousands of Mexican workers came here. They were promised jobs and good wages. Among the first to arrive was the father of David Velasquez. He left Mexico with a few bags and a contractor's words of great opportunity still echoing in his head.
My father came over to Morenci in about 1906, and he used to live in Chihuahua. Apparently the American companies knew that the people from Chihuahua were experienced miners, so they used to send their people out there and recruit. And they come over what they used to call renganche. In other words, they recruit a bunch of people, of men especially, and bring them over all together.
Most of the mineros came from the northern Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, where they had been miners for generations. They were brought to a small mining district in eastern Arizona. Within a few years, Clifton-Morenci grew from 200 to 10,000. The mining boom was sparked by America's enormous appetite for copper. With the arrival of electricity, copper was needed for telephone lines, telegraph service, and power plants. Newcomers from all over came to work in Morenci. They shared one thing in common: the business of getting copper out of the ground. Using candles for light, the miners spent 12 hours a day underground. They worked 4,000 feet below the surface in a maze of tunnels 100 miles long. The shafts were supported only by wooden beams.
You can always hear the timber creaking like in an old house. Of course, the first thing you did when you went into your working place was look for loose boulders, loose rocks. And you put in timbers for as much room as you had. And you'd start drilling and just hope nothing fell on you.
Work areas were cramped. The air was thin. Temperatures would rise to 104 degrees. As experienced miners, the mineros were accustomed to harsh conditions underground. What they weren't prepared for was the way they were treated simply because they were Mexican. Sylvester Mowry, an early traveler to Arizona, wrote,
"My own experience has taught me that the lower class of Mexicans are docile, faithful, good servants. They have been peons for generations, It is their natural condition.
Mexicans were assigned the worst jobs in the mines, and the most dangerous. Supports were paid $4 a day. Mexican timbermen received $2. Anglo muckers who shoveled the ore out of the mines were paid $1.50 a day. Mexican muckers were paid 70 cents. This dual-wage system persisted throughout the mining industry.
Nos trajeron porque podemos trabajar.
They brought us for our skills, and now they treat us worse than dogs.
Que no somos como ellos.
Because we are not like them, they forget we are men.
In those days, a lot of them suffered. They were the burros, the ones that did all the work in those mines. See what I mean? Those were the guys that producing and dying in there.
The minero not only faced hardship in the mines, but also in town, a company town, built chiefly by the Phelps Dodge Corporation. Like all such towns, the company owned and operated everything, from the waterworks to the hospital to the workers' homes. Miners bought their food and dry goods at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile Store, where markups of 200% were common. With a day's salary, a miner could only buy a dozen eggs and a pound of coffee.
It was hard on my father because he didn't know how to speak English. He didn't know how to add or subtract. I saw receipts from the grocery store where they would add them up. They didn't have an adding machine at that time. They add them up by hand. 6 and 6, 15. 1 and carry the 5. Always to the store advantage.
The Morenci Club was where company officials and their families spent their free time. Here they could play billiards, tennis, and bridge. The club was off limits to Mexicans, as were all Anglo establishments. Socializing between Anglos and Mexicans was strictly forbidden.
This one morning when I went to work, told me the mine superintendent wanted to see me. I went over and he said, Avery, you had so-and-so up at your house last night. And I said, yeah. He said, you don't have Mexicans come to your house. I said, well, goddamn, it's my house. I'll have anybody come to it I want. He said, no, if you won't. He said, that's a company house. And he said, you work for the company. Remember that.
Mexicans were forced to live in the most undesirable parts of town, usually along steep hillsides. In Morenci, the Mexican side of town was called Chihuahua Hill. Unlike Anglo neighborhoods, Mexican homes had no electricity or running water. Most houses were made from scrap wood supplied by the company.
In the hill where we used to live, they call it Chihuahuita, because there was a lot of people from Chihuahua. Most of those people had to build their own shacks, just get 1x12s, put them together, make a room and a roof, and cover them with a muslin. A lot of the people, all they had was those powder boxes, wooden powder boxes they used as chairs. I remember that a lot of times we see people moving from one house to the other, and they always did it at night. And one time I asked my mother, she says, how come they always do it at night? Why don't they do it in daytime? He said, well, he says their furniture is so bad that they want to move at night when people won't see what they have.
Okay, what is important to appreciate is the four-part process that the community faced: racism and discrimination, educational deprivation, political disfranchisement, and economic marginality through a dual-wage system. Yet Mexican labor was needed. So please understand that labor organizing and the socialist tradition in both Mexico and the United States between 1880 and 1920 is so crucial to this generation because their movements for change reflect the people's commitment to constructing a just society. In both the United States and Mexico, there are very strong socialist traditions. And the peoples who were the socialists, they're the reason why we must pay attention to social change and development of consciousness. Because on both sides of the border, both Mexicans and Americans understood that socialism is a process of ideas whereby people arrange, design, and construct a just society. And the central goal of socialism is humankind. So in the United States, people underwent what was known as the populist revolt and progressive reform between 1880 and 1920. And what happened in the United States was that people, through farmers' associations, through labor organizations, and through women's rights movements, argued for immigrant rights, for workers' rights, for children's rights. And they were able to pass legislation that would assist them in making sure that the federal government would not just cater to business, but also to people. And so students, if you have ever taken a U.S. history class, you need to understand that there was the populist revolt and progressive reform in the United States. Well, meanwhile, people in Mexico were undergoing a revolution, and they wanted to radically reconstruct a constitution that gave meaningful voice to the equal distribution of the wealth and to end racial and gender discrimination. So both in the United States and Mexico, people placed at their respective movements' center a concept of direct participatory mass democracy, an involvement by everyone in the decisions that directed the social order. Because in both the United States and Mexico at the turn of the century, people called for not just political democracy, which means the right to vote, but they also called for economic democracy, the right to a living wage. They called for social equality, the right to be free in your expression of culture. And they called for an end to racial discrimination and to gender bias. So we're going to return to the documentary on Los Mineros, and we will witness how Mexicans formed mutual aid societies, and they attempted to be recognized as unions in an effort to end the dual wage system. And they did this in a strike at Clifton-Morenci, which will be known as the 1903 strike, the Clifton-Morenci 1903 strike. Let's listen to how white miners used their nativism to disdain their Mexican counterparts.
A sense of community developed in Chihuahuita. Shut out by the Anglos, the Mineros started societies of their own, called mutualistas, or mutual aid societies.
Mutualistas were very important for Mexicans to combat racism. The Alianza Hispanoamericana, or La Liga Protectora, made it very clear that they were there to protect the rights of Mexicans, to speak out for the Mexican, to help them in any way that they could.
The mutualistas offered burial insurance and sponsored social events, and increasingly tried to deal with a hostile Anglo world. A report from the Department of Interior in 1908 stated,
"The Mexican laborer is unambitious, listless, physically weak, irregular, and indolent. His strongest point is his willingness to work for low wages."
As the mine owners aggressively recruited Mexican labor, Anglo workers were terrified their own jobs were in jeopardy because Mexicans worked for so little. The Anglos turned to a union, the Western Federation of Miners. The WFM decided the best way to protect Anglos was to drive the Mexicans out of the mines. The anti-Mexican campaign began with a devious plan. Anglos were paid by the day, the Mexicans by the hour. The union forced the copper companies to cut the workday from 10 hours to 8 hours. Overnight, the mineros suffered a 20% cut in pay. On the morning of June 3rd, 1903, for the first time in Arizona history, over 1,000 Mexican workers went out on strike. The mining companies refused to negotiate. Abraham Salcido, a 26-year-old minero from Chihuahua, led the strike against the company, becoming a folk hero in the process.
Estos versos que yo canto se convierten en corrido.
The verses that I sing is a corrido to remember a hero whose name is Abraham Salcido.
Abraham Salcido vino a Clifton, Arizona.
He came to Clifton, Arizona
Ayudarle a sus paisanos
to help his countrymen earn an equal wage like the Americans.
sueldo como los americanos.
The mineros armed themselves and took control of the mines, shutting down the smelters and mills. The governor asked the Mexican consul to come talk some sense to the Mexicans and ordered 300 Arizona Rangers to the scene. "2,000 miners marched in solidarity through the town, openly taunting the Rangers. The governor cabled President Roosevelt asking for cavalry support.
Comenzaron la discordia, les llegó una tempestad.
At the height of the tension, a heavy thunderstorm broke. A massive flood swept over the city.
La ciudad.
When the flood hit the Mexican side of town, 50 people were killed instantly. Most of their homes were destroyed. The next day, federal troops disarmed the strikers and placed the community under martial law. Ten of the strike leaders were arrested, including Abraham Salcido. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for inciting a riot. Within 2 weeks, the strikers were back at work. The strike had failed. The dual wage system was still in place. The mineros had lost the opening skirmish, but the battle was far from over.
Every day, people was getting hurt underground mining. A lot of times, people will blow up working with the dynamite. And sometimes, the tunnels where they're working will cave in. Almost every day, they used to bring out somebody with a broken leg, broken arm, broken something, neck or something like that. Every day used to happen that.
A lot of them got cut by those motor cars they had in there that pulled those little old cars. Sometimes it was pretty dark in there, you know, with the dust and fumes in there, and these guys couldn't see those motor cars coming, and I saw a lot of them die.
There was not too much protection for the workers. They did most of the drilling dry. They didn't have respirators. The only thing they could do was cover their face with a handkerchief.
Among the worst threats miners faced was silicosis, known as miner's consumption. 1 out of every 3 miners got this deadly lung condition from years of breathing the mineral dust.
My father, after putting about 22 years underground, he could barely breathe.
He coughs day and night. because his lungs are full of it. That dust, you know. Can't get it out of there no more. They cough day and night, and every time they cough, they throw out small pieces of lungs until the lungs disappear and they die. It's painful.
I remember when my father died, we took him by horse buggy from here down to the depot. Any worker that died, that worked for the company at that time, the company would furnish the train. They would take him by train to the cemetery. And they used to call it the Catholic cemetery because all the Chicanos were Catholics. They wouldn't want to call it the Mexican cemetery, so they just call it the Catholic cemetery.
Okay, just south of Clifton-Morenci, there occurred a major battle involving a transnational corporation practicing a dual-wage system. Only this time the dual-wage system favored American immigrant workers over Mexican citizens. Yes, American immigrants who worked in Mexico are going to get a better wage than Mexicans in Mexico. In an isolated spot bordering southeastern Arizona and northeastern Sonora during June 1906, a strike took place in the Mexican mining town of Cananea, Sonora. Now, since the late 19th century, the Nogales-based Cananea Consolidated Copper Company paid over 5,000 Mexican workers half the wages per day that over 2,000 American immigrant workers were earning for the same job. So conditions in which the Mexican employees worked were deplorable. And so during the celebration of Cinco de Mayo, May 5th, the Mexican employees made public their complaints while the local authority applied martial law to avoid further conflict. Striking workers in Cananea confronted U.S. soldiers protecting the company store. So we're going to return to the documentary on Los Mineros, which is a documentary that I'm asking you to view for this particular unit. And we're going to witness an effort to end the dual-wage system in Cananea, Mexico, under the Porfirio Diaz regime. Again, this is under the Porfiriato. So let's appreciate Abraham Salcido. Now, one of the reasons Mexicans sing corridos, as you listen to the last the Clifton-Morenci strike of Abraham Salcido, the corrido of Abraham Salcido, is that corridos are sung to honor those who help us remember a moment of resistance against oppression. And basically, corridos in Mexican experience retell a story of what was once lived. Corridos are popular cultural expressions that recount struggles to achieve justice against institutionalized racism. And remember, the Mexican working classes do not have a middle class by which they can have their histories written. So the ways that they write their history is through song, hence the corrido. So let's make sense of the Cananea strike in 1906 and see if we can appreciate the corrido of Abraham Salcido. You see, after 3 years in an Arizona prison for the Clifton-Morenci strike of 1903, he's going to go down to Cananea along the border and continue the organizational struggles of Mexican workers. And he will organize another strike in Cananea in 1906. So let's go witness that strike.
40 miles south of the U.S. border was a mining empire in Cananea, Mexico. An American, Colonel William Greene, owned the Cananea Copper Company. Mexican President Porfirio Diaz had enticed foreign industrialists to take advantage of Mexico's rich natural resources. By 1906, Cananea looked more like a company town in Arizona than a Mexican pueblo. The town's most prominent structure was not the Catholic Church, but Colonel Green's two-story clapboard mansion. The Mineros suffered the same conditions as their countrymen north of the border. They endured segregated housing, lack of promotion, and even in Mexico, a dual-wage system.
The Americans were paid the number 3 in dollars, and the Mexicans were paid 3 pesos. The rate of exchange was 2 to 1, so automatically Americans for the same type of work got paid twice as much.
Outraged by this oppressive treatment of their fellow countrymen, Mexican intellectuals and political activists began to organize. Cananea became a symbol of foreign tyranny.
Señores mineros, teach the American you are not beasts of burden. The American who has displaced us with his legion of blue-eyed blondes, Esteban Calderon.
My father was a baker, and he owned a bakery there in Cananea. But yet he was one of those liberal types, and I guess he liked to play politics. He would sympathize with the miners or the conditions that they were subject. So over here, there was a little place called Ori Plata, where they used to plan their tragedies.
Abraham Salcido was released from prison in Arizona in the spring of 1906. He went directly to Cananea to join the labor organizers working in the mines. On June 2nd, that same year, the Mineros went out on strike. They gathered to present their demands to company officials.
Colonel Green personally came out and talked to the miners and told them that he wanted to raise their salaries, but that the President of Mexico wouldn't allow it, that he was asking them as a friend to go back to work.
The strikers refused. Dressed in their Sunday best, they marched through the camp to gather supporters. Over 2,500 arrived at the company's lumber yard, run by 2 Americans, George and Will Metcalf. George had been warned the strikers were coming.
The first thing that the 2 Metcalf brothers did inside of the lumberyard was to turn on the hoses that they had in case of a fire, and they trained it on the crowd. This infuriated the miners, so they forced the doors open. The 2 Metcalf brothers shot, apparently first into the air and then directly into the crowd, killing 2 or 3 of the miners. The miners set fire to the office of the lumberyard to smoke the 2 Metcalf brothers out. They came out still shooting, and the miners killed them both. One of them was apparently killed with his own rifle, and the other one was clubbed to death and stuck to death with miners' candlesticks that they were still carrying during the march that they had. Once they had killed the 2 Metcalf brothers, the miners were met by a group of about 30 armed Americans headed by Green, and the shooting began again.
By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mexican troops arrived to put down the strike. They were joined by 270 Arizona Rangers who had been armed at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile store. The Rangers had violated Mexican law in crossing the border with arms. To avoid an international incident, they were hastily deputized by the Mexican state governor. By the next day, the strike had been put down. Once again, Abraham Salcido and the other strike leaders were jailed for inciting a riot.
My father was arrested and sent to prison. They never could prove anything. So he came to the United States and he says, I've had enough of that thing in Mexico.
23 people lost their lives at Cananea, 17 of them Mexican. The strike had failed. None of the strikers' demands was met. But the Cananea strike would give birth to the first major revolution of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution. In the end, Porfirio Diaz would be in exile, and 1 million of his countrymen would lay dead. The violence of the Mexican Revolution would have a lasting impact on the border region. Volatile racial tensions were inflamed. Arizonans feared the bloodshed would spill over the border.
Okay, students, so we can understand something about the violence of the Mexican Revolution. And when we take a look at the Cananea strike of 1906, I mean, you got to recognize how Abraham Salcido put his life on the line for the future generations. Again, he just came out of prison after 3 years, and then goes to the Cananea situation, and then is incarcerated again. Now, although the workers were forced to return to their positions with no demand being met, this action was a key event in the general unrest that emerged during the final years of the regime of Porfirio Diaz, known as the Porfiriato. And this strike prefigured the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So let's appreciate again migration and immigration, because the workers, regardless of the border, they're working. And again, it's U.S. corporations that are forming and controlling the labor forces. Keep that in mind. And again, the racism of Arizona is expressed as armed rangers crossed the border into Mexico to attack Mexicans. Now go figure how the Mexican government is going to deputize the Arizona Rangers as these racists crossed the Mexican border to kill Mexicans in Mexico. And the Mexican government will deputize them. So if you can figure that out, then you can recognize something about the chaos that led to the Mexican Revolution. Now, despite the chaos, people are going to tolerate their experiences, because after all, acute disillusionment can rob life of its meaning, so the people have to look within by which to say, yes, we can celebrate ourselves. And they can celebrate their identity through culturally based music, dance, and food preparation. So let's go back to the Minero struggle and appreciate how they celebrated despite the adversity.
To survive in this hostile environment, the Mineros turned inward, looking to each other for help and support. Strong ties of language and culture kept them united. On Mexican holidays, everyone in Chihuahuita turned out to celebrate.
They used to have a town band, and they used to have concerts at the plaza. You know, had a little kiosk, the gazebo, I think they call it. And it was something like a family day. The big fiesta was on 16th of September, Cinco de Mayo. They used to have games and contests and races and boxing matches. They used to have what they called charrascas, which was house parties. They had a regular orchestra, you know, violin, guitar, and maybe a bass.
We used to have good orchestra.
Very good music. Besos y cerezas. You never heard that, did you?
I had to bake 2 pies or 3 pies every Saturday, or 2, 3 cakes every Saturday, so I could go to the dance.
And of course, they always had a tub full of ice and beer. It used to be homebrewed. kids used to go there and stand out on the porch and look inside, look at the grown-ups dancing and kicking up quite a storm.
They were really
Yeah, but
dances.
what
We
you- what
wear
you're
long
talking-
dresses.
What you're talking about
long
is
dresses.
Ooh, we used to dance the floor with that one. Ooh.